Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Today, I want to talk about one of the too often neglected aspects of unionization, the breaking down of various forms of bigotry with a specific focus on racial animus. The super short version is that union solidarity helps reduce racial animosity. Now, that doesn't mean that this has been, is, or always will be true. In fact, many, and even most unions back in the day, in the late 19th and early 20th century, were explicitly racist and segregated. I don't want to sound like I'm simply blowing by that fact, and we will most likely hit on that a few times as we go forward. And it doesn't mean that some super racist neo-Nazi KKK member will sign a union card and will suddenly turn into the most woke human on the planet. But unions have, historically, and more importantly, in once desegregated post-civil rights era, been a positive influence on racism amongst workers in those unions. There are a lot of reasons for this, which we will discuss as we go on. But I do also want to note that I believe, and this is my own thing here because I didn't find as much talking about this stuff as I did for race, but I believe that basically everything that I'm going to point out, and highlight and talk about concerning race is also true about things like religion, culture, and classism. Basically, I'm suggesting that all, or at least most of the things about unions which promote racial inclusion affect these other issues in the same or similar ways. I'll try to throw a few reminders in here as we move forward about this because I think it's both important and interesting to think about. So I've mentioned this idea about unions reducing bigotry and specifically racism a few times in past episodes, and even other places around the internet and in real life, and it's always met with a bit of disbelief and skepticism. But here's the thing. The very structure and purpose of a union is based on solidarity, and this solidarity brings people together, which, I guess is obvious just definitionally in the word solidarity. And they also help teach their members about things like politics, political machinations, and to put it in a very simple language, having a specific goal and working towards that goal as a unified group. This all brings people together and forces them to work shoulder to shoulder even more so than their work does, which creates a familiarity and so on and reduces judgments based on outward appearances. For whatever reason, it just seems like people want to reject this notion outright without really examining what's going on. And, I guess, too bad if you're listening because we are going to explore this together right now. And hello there, everybody. As most of you probably know, this podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together and, to get out there for you good folks to listen to. And you, our listeners, can help us by liking and subscribing on YouTube. So please take a second to click those little buttons. It helps a ton. And if you are feeling just a little bit more generous and you enjoy what we do here at Tribunus Plebis Media, you can help us earn just a little bit of money for the large amount of labor that we put into this thing by signing up on our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can make a one-time donation or sign up for a recurring monthly subscription. We do all of this for free, and we will never run ads in our works. But any contributions really do help keep the show going and improving. The page address is buymeacoffee.com/TribunusPlebis. And of course, all links will be in the show notes and descriptions wherever you are listening or watching. Thank you. And now, back to the episode. So let's go back in time a bit to when unions weren't quite so wonderful. There's a lot of history here of union racism and integration and alliances and fracturings for strategic purposes. Basically a lot of bad stuff with a few good moments mixed in here and there. And I don't want to go too deep into history, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. The pre-civil rights era history of unions and race is, at worst, utterly horrific. And at best, pretty bad. There aren't too many brightly shining beacons there. One interesting story to look at is that of the Louisiana longshoremen before, during, and after the American Civil War. And before I dive in here, I do want to mention something that I'll mention later, and it's something which is mentioned in the most influential paper I could find on this, this subject here. It was written by Paul Freimer and Jacob Grumbach of Princeton University and somewhere else. University of Washington. They note that unions were begun at specific times and places, and that they were born of particular material conditions. And this isn't to take away the base grossness of the racism here or the segregation. I just think it's important to think about, the time and place that these workers toiled. And just to be clear, none of this was good. It was just racism at the end of the day. I'm not trying to defend people for being racist here. But that said, before the war, the union workers on the New Orleans waterfront, mostly newly immigrated white Europeans, were abolitionists. They vocally decried slavery. And now I'm sure some part of this was moral, but we have to face the facts here that a good portion, or perhaps even most of this movement, was because of financial considerations. For the dock workers, slavery drove down wages. That's just the reality of the world that these men lived in, and they saw it for what it was. Free labor causes wages to decline. Seems obvious, right? So the workers, with a mix of economic and moral conviction, wanted, an end to slavery. And then the war happened, and it was fought out, the North won, and slavery was abolished. And then the dock workers of Louisiana encountered another economic reality. Suddenly, waves of newly freed black people wanted jobs, and there was a downward pressure on wages. And when the black men who worked on the piers formed their own local, the white unions rejected working with them, blaming the black men for lowering wages. Now, a little bit later, less than a decade later, just to kind of show how complicated and weird the whole union and race relationship could be, these same dock workers would unify together and eventually integrate their unions when they, they realized that working together would provide them all better wages than being divided would. And there are stories similar to this all through the history of industrial labor, both with and without union involvement, and situations like this were taken advantage of by the capitalist owners and industrialists. In fact, sometimes they would actually create these situations on purpose. These men would use racial resentments to drive perpetual and often violent wedges between white workers and black. And the same sorts of wedges would be hammered home between native white workers and immigrant white workers as well, by the way. It was a prime tactic of industry and factory owners to divide workers by status. Now, there is part of a work by W.E.B. Du Bois which highlights another way that this sort of divide was perpetuated by white workers with what Du Bois called the psychological wage of segregation and racist work conditions. So if you'll pardon, a somewhat lengthy quote here, this is from Black Reconstruction in America by Du Bois, a book which we should all read, by the way. Quote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their vote selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost utterly ignored the Negro, except in crime and ridicule." End quote. So even though the white workers received low wages, at least they weren't black. And this was something that the capitalists and the union heads and organizers glommed onto, this psychological wage idea. Unions would even support racist immigration laws, most famously stumping for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Immigration Act of 1924. The second of these effectively throttled nearly all immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere, a move promoted by racial fears. Not all unions were racist, though. Most famous of these were the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and others were not explicitly racist, though their own policies essentially prevented blacks and Asians in particular from joining. Basically a sort of poll tax or poll test, ways to keep out non-whites without actually saying it out loud. One of the earliest large unions in the U.S. was the Knights of Labor, a group which aimed to organize across all racial and gender lines. But yet at the same time, they supported the Chinese Exclusion Act, while the San Francisco chapter likened the Chinese to animals in one of its newsletters. And as we can probably guess, truly integrated unions like the IWW were very much a rare thing before the 20th century, and very much uncommon until post-1932 when the Wagner Act passed, but especially until post-World War II in the Civil Rights Act. And it was really after the Civil Rights Act when the unions truly began to shed the last of their overtly discriminatory ways and include minorities and women all across the board. And this is where we kind of run into the modern day and where we'll discuss how and why unions help defeat racism. Okay, so I'm going to assume that we all know what a union is, just to save some time here and skip to the good stuff. The major basic building block here is that unions work better when more people, when a higher percentage of people in a particular sector are organized. To do this, especially in racially diverse industries, sectors, or workplaces, requires union leaders and organizers to recruit workers of color to achieve the sorts of sector majorities that they need to be effective. And once these various groups have been organized together, there is an ideological and a strategic incentive to lower racial resentment amongst its members to keep the union happy, healthy, and growing. Not to mention willing to work together to negotiate, vote, and even strike if necessary. Now, on the other side of that is the more everyday, more real reasons from a more direct worker's perspective. And these might seem incredibly obvious to some, but, I hope that it could also kind of, trigger little light bulb moments in the rest of the listeners out there. Unions help promote something as simple as people of different backgrounds working together. This could be, racial background or cultural background or even class background as we talk about it in the U.S. We have people from poor families working with more well-off families and so on. It also includes geographic stuff too. Suburbanites working with inner-city folks and so on. And in sort of a related note and anecdote, I grew up in the sort of stereotypical suburban Caucasian land that, everyone's heard of before. Sort of a slightly dirtier, less utopian beaver cleaver land. My first ever job was working in an inner city scrapyard. And let me tell you something, man. There are few things in life that are as eye-opening to the suburban child as swinging sledgehammers to bust cast iron in a line with heroin users, felons, roughnecks, goons, and, they were all just good damn people who would never end up having the way out that I ended up having. Nothing at all. Nothing in my 45 years of life has ever come even close to making me a better human being, a less judgmental person, or a more empathic person than working with that most diverse group of people that I've ever been around. Except maybe when I'd go drinking with them all after work when I was old enough to. And people like to say that hard work makes you a better person. but I don't necessarily think that's really true. It might be a little true. But when I was stacking car batteries or sorting brass fixtures or down in a sewer, scooping up slop with buckets or swinging that sledgehammer, it wasn't the work that made me a better man. It was talking to the people around me and hearing their stories and sharing my own. For me, it wasn't, really a race thing that I was working on. It was more of a, socioeconomic and cultural things. I had preconceived notions and judgments before I worked in this scrapyard, and none of them lasted to the end of the 2 years that I worked there. Too much time spent with too many good people from differing backgrounds knocked all of that out of me. And this is where unions shine because, while work forces us to work in the same place, unions get us to work together. Unions make whatever bonds might form at work even stronger. As an example, you may have heard about the Tesla plants where all the black workers were sent to work in one corner of the building. And the white workers and bosses called that section the plantation, and they said even more racist stuff that I'm not going to repeat here. And, maybe you heard about how the black workers never ate or hung out with the white workers. That's the sort of thing that collective action can break up. I mean, they had a place in the plant called the plantation where they put all of the black workers, and none of the workers had any say in this or any way to fix it. A union would have given them a path. The very structure and impact of unionization on a workplace can help get workers integrated together, and just being involved with a union creates socialization with meetings, speeches, votes, and so on. It mobilizes workers to vote in union elections and to share political information both for within the workplace and right up to the national elections. And that's not even to mention all the important negotiations for new contracts and work rules. And when you combine all of this, unions are pretty unique. They have a structure which supports the breaking down of racism, and that structure is then applied to our workplace, a place which essentially forces us to socialize, and which is perhaps the place that most of us socialize the most. We might live in a white neighborhood and attend a white church and, a mostly white social club and have mostly white friends. And you can swap out black or Latino or rich or poor in that sentence as well. And then we go to work and we work with those black and Latino and Asian people and we interact. What unions can do is to help us put our prejudices aside and understand that our collective interests are linked together. Then we talk and debate and vote on collective decisions over leadership and rules and, yes, even our pay. It's a cooperation that fundamentally requires active participation. People of all different stripes working together at work and then unifying outside of work to secure victories of a common interest. This isn't, of course, to say that all unions are perfect, or that all union members simply leave race at the door. Working closely together does not automatically lessen racial tensions. And for example, we can actually look at the United States military here, where studies have shown that racism actually increases for those who sign up to fight oil wars in other countries. Yes, the brotherhood of the military makes young people more racist by the time they leave. Maybe it's that particular job they do, or maybe it's the complete lack of collective decision-making, or the brutal hierarchy. I don't know, but just simply working together is obviously not a panacea by itself. And police are an example of the idea that simply being unionized isn't the be-all, end-all of racial harmony. I'm not even going to go into detail here, but cops are garbage, and policing tends to exacerbate the racism of those who make a career of it. And also, cop unions should not exist, by the way, just to be clear. Labor unions create a culture of multiracial solidarity, at least at work and within the union. Again, I don't want to romanticize this or go overboard with what I'm saying. But they also go beyond this as well. They even reward it. The more cooperative and unified a union is, the greater the rewards. Solidarity forever, right? The other interesting thing here is that integration at work, in neighborhoods and the home, and having access to decision making and the politics of our work increases cooperation and breaks down barriers. But even beyond that is the fact that all of these interactions, the working next to each other, sharing of lunchrooms at work, going to union meetings and voting, it's the sharing of and active participation in various social practices and cultural affects that are facilitated by the very nature of labor unions that creates even deeper bonds. You add all of that up and factor in that workplaces are the single biggest point of contact and cooperation, and by their very nature encourage common goals and collective actions, then it seems obvious that simple contact in and around work should reduce biases. And hundreds of studies show that it does. Work and the unions that organize them are sites and organizations which bring people into lengthy contact with people of different demographic backgrounds, race, social, economic, and so on a daily basis. But a workplace with no union has a much higher danger of becoming like those racist shithole Tesla factories that apartheid baby Elon Musk runs, where black workers are relegated to the quote-unquote plantation while white workers are treated better. Those Tesla workers have no way to challenge the hierarchy of the factory because they are not united. They are kept apart intentionally. In short, Tesla and Musk do not want the majority of workers to work together to fight them. And to have a majority, it requires workers of all colors and creeds, not just those of a single group. Unions, on the other hand, are predicated on having a majority in the workplace, and unifying that majority to work both together and towards a greater goal. This then pushes unions to engage with whatever socioeconomic or political or cultural divisions there are in the workplace and to promote toleration and unity. And just to touch back on my scrapyard days back when I first started driving a truck for them, when I was 18 years old, one day I went out to a place that was about 30 minutes away. And I did my pickup and I headed back and my truck started to overheat. There's a hole in the radiator hose. Now, at the time I didn't have a phone. I must have left it at home, I guess. But I didn't have it with me. I didn't have any money. This is back in the days of payphones for the old heads out there. So I kind of just nursed it back in, and it took over an hour to get back. When I finally arrived, the owner came out and just started yelling at me and throwing papers around and screaming about how lazy I was. Where was I? I was stealing time and, all that sort of crap. And, I didn't say anything because, to be honest, I was kind of scared. I knew I did my best to get back, but now this millionaire asshole is screaming at me, and he can fire me at a whim. And so I just stood there and I got yelled at. I was too sheepish at 18 to argue back. So I went to the garage, and the fellas were like, "Oh boy, you screwed up, huh?" And then I told them what happened, and the mechanic looked at the truck and saw the hole in the radiator hose. And the three guys who were really the most, influential of all the workers there, they talked for a bit and then they said, "Come with us." And they walked into the office with me sheepishly in tow, and they proceeded to yell at the owner of the company and tell him that I had saved the truck, that I had saved the cost of a tow, and that I really didn't deserve being screamed at, especially since he never even asked what happened, and he just sort of assumed that I was being a bad employee. Then they demanded that he apologize to me. And he did. And like I said, these were three of the most diverse people that were there. Two of them basically hated each other and had multiple fistfights in the past. But when it came down to it, they all came together to help me. The collective group actually had power where the 18-year-old kid did not. Or I guess adult. I guess I was an adult at the time, just not a confident one. And there were also similar small acts of solidarity there as well, like how everyone in the break room would shut up when the boss walked in to get coffee. And he'd say hello, he'd get his coffee and leave, and the talking would start again. The message was that this was definitely not a place for bosses, and the bosses shouldn't feel like they belonged there. In fact, the silence made it deeply uncomfortable. This was a workers-only break room because workers and bosses just aren't the same. That was another lesson that stuck. But anyway, that experience always sticks with me. That my coworkers saw a wrong done and they unified to fix it, even when they didn't even like each other. They weren't in a union, but they understood the power that they had together. That is solidarity in a nutshell. So, okay, maybe I meandered a bit there to hopefully try to make a point with my anecdote, but let me just try to summarize and wrap this up real quick. Our workplaces are the places that we are most often in which we socialize, and unions actually increase socialization within our workplace. We work shoulder to shoulder with people of diverse backgrounds, and then when organized into a union, we stand shoulder to shoulder with those same people and we fight together in common cause for common goals. This creates more and positive experiences of intergroup mixing, which undermines prejudice. And this effect tends to be carried home and not just get left either at work or in the union hall. Again, this isn't a miracle cure for racists and Nazis, but studies do show that unions help lower racism across the board. Unions further influence its members' political and social views by exposing them to both relevant knowledge and also knowledge presented under a unified framing, even going so far as to expose the workers of one union to the workers of many other unions. This influence means that unions themselves, meaning the organizations, tend to support progressive agendas, and the workers themselves tend to support progressive politics more so than non-union workers. Research has also shown that union-inspired interactions between socially and politically different people creates interpersonal links which can help promote more tolerance and motivate the parties to moderate their views and move towards each other. Now, I don't necessarily know that the idea of moving towards each other, which, kind of sounds like centrism to me, is an unalloyed good. I've even done an entire episode on centrism that might interest folks, but I'm going to share this quote. Quote, "Over time, there is, in general, no consistent or precisely estimated relationship between union membership and civil rights liberalism. But since 1996, the relationship clearly appears to have trended notably more positive over time. Even in 2016, where significant numbers of white workers turned to Trump, the results remain quite muted given the historical context." End quote. That last quote presented for, whatever it's worth to you. And to end this, I guess I'll say this. I'll say that unions are very much of their times. They develop historically out of specific political, social, and material conditions. They exist within an amalgam of changing circumstances, and they are built of constantly fluctuating demographics and are in constant flux and evolution. And all of these antagonistic forces that they deal with are created and then reinforced and altered by capitalism itself in an effort to break worker solidarity and the unions which help facilitate it. Right now, unions face the forces of so-called right-to-work states, constant unending political attacks, and new capitalist strategies like creating the gig economy and precarious work, and perhaps the most devious new creation of them all, the independent contractor. But we can't let the ghouls and the dorks win. Right now, our bosses are telling us to put our heads down and do our individual best, while also telling us that Bob at the next desk is trying to steal our job. They claim that they're like family. They tell us to not let anyone get between them and us like a union would. And then, rather than promote integration and democracy, they shove some workers to the plantation and treat others slightly better and profit from the tension between the groups. They want us to think of each other as competition, not as allies. A couple of episodes back, was it last episode? Anyway, I talked about class in America and how the elites want to divide us into a dozen economic classes like the middle class, upper middle class, and upper class, and lower upper class, and so on. But I also explained that the reality is that the workers are all one class. the working class, the proletariat. Slavery is largely over. Jim Crow is largely over. Redlining is largely over. And yes, we still see and feel the effects of this all through society. I won't say that I feel it because, I'm a white dude. I don't feel it like some others do. But I know it's there. I see at least its shadow across the country. But racism continues to tear into this country. Look at this entire Kanye situation as an example, and look at how flat out sad and despicable it all is. And yes, racism certainly does remain, and racists remain as well. And we need to organize, unionize, work together, and undertake ventures which by their very existence helps us all see that there are goals out there worth achieving, and that the best way to do so is to make cause of common interests, no matter our race or creed or culture, even more importantly, no matter the race, creed, or culture of the worker standing with us on the picket lines as we fight for better wages, better lives, and healthier bodies. Unions aren't the only way there, but I would say that the efficacy that they bring into the fight is utterly indispensable. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. I hope you liked it. Please subscribe, like, comment wherever you are, especially if you're on YouTube, subscribe. I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers. That would be awesome. We have a Buy Me a Coffee page. If you have a couple bucks a month that you can spare to keep this project going, that would be much appreciated. All the links are below in the description. You can also make one-time donations on that page. It's super easy. I guess that's about it. Thank you guys. I love you all.